Well, kia ora tato, thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. I've never been to a Rotary meeting before, so it's all new to me, but it feels really good. As John mentioned, following an extended period of fundraising and consultation, in late 2013, Victoria University established a Professorial Chair in Restorative Justice, which is located not in the School of Law, Faculty of Law, not in Criminology, but in the School of Government. The aim of the chair is to serve as a catalyst for collaborative interdisciplinary research and teaching on a subject of growing international importance. I was fortunate enough to be appointed to the position, which I took up in early 2014. And again, as John mentioned, the chair was in August last year named the Diana Unwin Chair in Restorative Justice in honour of the passing of a remarkable Wellington philanthropist who contributed funding to the position along with 8 different government agencies. The 3 justice agencies, Police, Corrections and Justice, the Ministry of Education, if I remember them all now, the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, ACC, Defence. How many is that? Have I missed any? That's enough. There's a lot. There's 8 of them, which I said recently at a conference, I'm very proud of the fact that we managed to get such a wide range of government agencies in behind the position. To the best of my knowledge, the chair is the only one of its kind in the world. Now, certainly there are other academics around the globe who specialise in restorative justice research and teaching, but as far as I can tell, there are no other cases elsewhere in the world of multiple government agencies combining their resources in conjunction with a private charitable trust to fund a senior academic post in restorative justice. So the new chair, even if I achieve nothing in the 4 years that my funding is secured, the new chair is a remarkable example of public and private sector collaboration in search of shared social outcomes. If we were to ask, or if you were to ask, why has the government taken such an interest in restorative justice? Why have all these agencies decided at a time of considerable financial squeeze to contribute funding to a position in restorative justice? I think a large part of the answer would be because the government believes increasingly that restorative justice has a particular role to play in helping to meet the needs and uphold the rights of victims. And that's what I want to focus on in this little talk. Many people in the community, if they know anything about restorative justice, often wrongly assume that restorative justice is about being nicer to offenders. But in truth, it is about being more respectful and supportive of victims. Although I would resist the kind of dualistic labelling of people that we undertake, but really its victim focus is predominant. So what I want to do in this very short talk is reflect a little bit on the experience of victimization, what it is like to be a victim, especially of a crime, and why it is that I believe with all of my heart that restorative justice is something rather important to offer to victims of crime, and for that matter, victims of other calamities as well. But I want to focus particularly on victims of crime. Historically, the Western criminal justice system has given scant attention to the needs of victims. The overwhelming emphasis has been on the punishment of offenders and the preservation of the state's interests. You could say, and I don't think it's really too much of an oversimplification, that the criminal justice system really exists to answer 3 questions, which are what rules have been broken, who broke them, and what punishment do they deserve? And in a sense, the elaborate and very expensive system we have in the criminal sphere anyway comes down to adjudicating on those 3 issues. Therefore, in that kind of system, victims are almost incidental to the judicial process because, technically speaking, the designated victim of a crime is the state, or even more specifically, the Queen, not the actual person injured. The role of the injured party is primarily to give evidence on behalf of the prosecution. And in many cases, they don't need to give evidence, and in many cases, they don't even need to be there because it's conducted on their behalf, with the emphasis lying elsewhere. Furthermore, when punishment is decided upon, the purpose of that punishment is not usually to help the victim, but rather to uphold the rule of law, to reinforce symbolically the standards that we expect society to abide by and to reinforce the authority of the court. Now, it shouldn't therefore be surprising, although it does often surprise victims, because most of us who become victims, our only and first experience of being that is when it happens to us. And we go into the system, if we have been a victim, rather naive about what the system is going to do. And when victims look to the formal justice system to bring them a sense of justice, they are frequently bitterly disappointed. They often end up angry and bewildered, feeling that the system has cheated them of what they were hoping for most of all, which is a sense that justice has been served. Public sensitivity to this problem has been heightened by the emergence of the so-called victims movement, which arose in the US about 45 years ago and has since spread around the world. One strand of the victims movement has been needs-focused. It is concentrated on rendering practical and emotional support to victims as they deal with the consequences of the offence. And in New Zealand, victim support would be an example of a needs-based expression of the victims movement. Another strand has been more rights-focused. It is agitated for institutional and legislative change to give victims particular legal rights, such as the right to be informed of their case, to participate in hearings, to be consulted about sentences or about parole, and even in some American jurisdictions, the right to witness capital punishment. In New Zealand, our example of a rights-based victims group, of course, is sensible sentencing. Unfortunately, there has been a pronounced tendency in the political arena to play the needs and rights of victims off against those of offenders. In the US, public sympathy for victims has been exploited by conservative law and order groups as a justification for coming down harder on offenders in the name of victims. In New Zealand as well, politicians over the past 2 or 3 decades have shown themselves acutely vulnerable to pressure from rights-based victims groups. And over recent years, New Zealand has witnessed an astronomical growth in the prison muster. I mean, all around the Western world over the past generation, although arguably more pronouncedly so in New Zealand than in most jurisdictions, heightened concern for the plight of victims has been accompanied by greater punitiveness towards offenders, despite falling crime rates. But it is a mistake to think that what is given to victims and what victims deserve must first be taken away from offenders. It need not be a zero-sum, I win, you lose kind of game. After all, one of the primary needs of victims is reassurance about their future safety. And the best way to provide that is working to rehabilitate offenders. It also needs to be remembered, although we often fail to do this, it needs to be remembered that many offenders offend as a direct result of their own prior victimisation, especially in childhood. There is a stunning correlation between what is now known as adverse childhood experiences and later involvement in the criminal justice system. A stunning correlation. Something like 80%, I don't know the New Zealand figures, but I guarantee it's the same, 80% of juvenile offenders in American youth custody institutions have been the victim of some childhood trauma. Such people hurt others because they have first been hurt, and I like this little saying, hurt people hurt people. People who have been hurt so often go on to hurt other people. They were victims before they became victimisers. If we are then to deal effectively with their criminal offending, we must address their needs as past victims of human malice or neglect or brutality. Now this leads to an important observation. As unwelcome as it may sound, what victims often need most, if they are to address the destructive legacy of their experience adequately, what they often need most is a direct engagement with the one who has offended against them. Now, this is not widely recognised in the community, and many would deny it is true. But arguably the bitterest feature of victimization is that victims are thrust against their wills into a profound relationship with the person who has harmed them. It is an uninvited, unhealthy, and deeply resented relationship. But it is still a relationship, one that has been born of the criminal event itself. So as well as coping with the impact of the crime, victims also need to cope with the relational bond it has created with the person who hurt them. And that bond is desperately real. When one person intentionally injures another, both victim and perpetrator are unavoidably bound together by their common experience. One is bound by guilt and by shame, the other by bitterness and by pain. Because they are bound together to the harmful event, victim and offender often need each other to experience liberation and healing from the continuing thrall of what has happened. If the offender is to change, he needs the victim to sharpen his sense of contrition and responsibility, to hear his confession, to acknowledge his guilt, and possibly to affirm his ability. I've seen this many times in restorative justice conferences, to affirm his ability to start afresh, to move on from what he has done or she has done. But the victim also needs the offender. Victims very often feel debased, dishonoured, disrespected, or shamed. They may become irritable or depressed, even suicidal. They feel that their freedom is constricted by fears and anxieties, by anger and by bitterness, by hatred and resentment. The pain of the offence and the memory of the offender, which grows in a person's mind to sort of fill their horizon, comes to exercise a continuing power over the victim's entire life. Every time they remember what's happened, the power of that hurt is triggered again. For this situation to change, as it needs to change if the victim is ever to find deliverance from what happened, the victim needs his or her relationship with the person who has caused the suffering to be transformed. Now, there are different ways that this can happen. It can happen through counselling. It can happen through cognitive therapy. It can happen through prayer. But arguably, the most effective way for it to happen is through a direct encounter with the offender. Because ironically, and perhaps sadly, it is the person who has most deeply injured us who is most empowered to trigger restoration in us. Frequently, what victims most need is for their abuser to hear of their pain, to answer their questions, to absorb their resentment, and to accept their dignity. Now, we might wish this were not so, and there will always be exceptions. But very often it is an inescapable component of the bond of victimization. Both parties are bound together by what happened, and hence both need each other to help transform that relationship into a healthy one. Each holds the key to the other's liberation. And this is where I think restorative justice has something special to offer. Restorative justice, as I'm sure you know, is a process that aims to bring together those who have been most affected by an incident of wrongdoing with trained facilitators to do what? Well, to name the wrong that has been done, to describe how the people have been personally affected by what happened, and to resolve together how best to repair as much as we can, to bring about repair and to prevent recurrence. The process is very simple, but believe me, and I've been doing this stuff for quite a long time now, and I never fail to be impressed by this. Believe me, the moral and emotional truths with which you engage are utterly profound. And when you address the injury that has occurred between people in this kind of way, you are in extremely deep waters. And there's one criticism that I will resist to my dying breath, which is this is all idealistic stuff that doesn't work in difficult situations. My experience and the research would suggest just the opposite of that. The deeper that injury, the stronger that bond that's been created, that unhealthy bond that's been created, the more powerful this kind of process can be. So what does restorative justice have to offer to victims in particular? It has a lot to offer offenders, there's a lot to offer society, it has a lot to offer our system, but it has a special offer to make to victims. In fact, I would suggest that a restorative justice conference between victims and offenders and their supporters is better able than the conventional justice processes that we have to meet at least 7 crucial needs of victims of crime. We actually know quite a lot about what victims need. There's a lot of research been done on this in the last 30 or so years. And again, can I say that the theory matches experience for me very, very much. My own son was the victim of a very vicious assault when he was 14 years old. I was chairing a restorative justice meeting at the time I got the call to say he was in hospital. And I saw these things played out before me in his experience, and I've seen it in the experience of many others. But I want to suggest to you that what we know of the needs of victims, restorative justice has a particular contribution to make to meet them. And I want to mention just very quickly 7. First of all, restorative justice conferences offer victims a safe space to speak of their experience. Arguably, safety is the #1 need that victims have. They need to feel safe again. And a restorative conference is a place both of physical safety, but it's also, because it's managed by facilitators, a place of emotional safety, where victims can express their anger and their fear without judgment or blame or skepticism. In the normal courtroom process, especially if the offender has pleaded not guilty, the victim's story is sometimes subject to very hostile interrogation by defence attorneys, and it must be narrated within very strict legal parameters, so that victims often don't feel safe in the very process that is dealing with their injury. They don't feel safe or sound. Restorative justice seeks to provide a place of safety. Secondly, restorative conferences offer victims validation and vindication. Again, contrary to what many people believe, victims usually want vindication more than vengeance or even punishment. That is to say, they want the wrong that they have suffered to be acknowledged and their dignity to be reaffirmed. They want their offender to admit his or her responsibility for causing the harm, and they want to be reassured that they didn't bring it on their own heads. That's what I mean by vindication and validation. And one of the interesting sub-themes of the research around restorative justice is that when they have sometimes talked to victims before and after a restorative justice encounter, they notice a marked decrease in the feelings of vengeance that the victims had. And I've reflected a bit on why this should be, and my answer is that the drive for vengeance is often the result of feeling angry and powerless at the same time. When you have anger and the inability to do anything about it, then it feeds a sense of wanting to strike back. A restorative conference, because it seeks to provide a place for the anger to be expressed positively, and it empowers the victim to actually engage with the person that's hurt them, often that deals with the root cause that would otherwise spill into this sense of vengeance. Thirdly, restorative justice conferences offer victims answers to their questions. When I was preparing this, I wanted whether to put this second, because I think that next to safety, the second priority for most victims is information. They want certain missing bits of the jigsaw to be supplied. They desperately want to know what happened, why it happened, what the offender was thinking about at the time, and whether he or she will do it again. Victimization invariably raises questions in the minds of those who have suffered, and answers to these questions are needed, not just desired, they are needed if they are to restore a sense of order and coherence to their lives. Regular courtroom hearings do not usually permit victims to ask all the questions that they have, and so often they end up still not knowing the things that they most desperately need to know. Fourthly, restorative justice conferences offer victims an opportunity for genuine truth-telling. Truthful speech, of course, is fundamental if justice is to be done. The conventional justice system works on this principle as well, with the court system existing to establish the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But in practice, the truth in question is often limited to clarifying facts and to establishing guilt. A narrow notion of legal truth supplants the fuller moral, spiritual, and experiential truth surrounding the crime. And even the legal truth sometimes gets obscured by technical language and by legislative details and loopholes and so on. Restorative justice seeks to make space for full emotional truth-telling. Time is given for offenders and victims, for their friends and supporters, to name the evil that has been done, to describe how it has affected them, and to speak about the needs that it has created. Truth-telling requires offenders to accept genuine responsibility for the harm they have caused, and the obligation that that brings with it to seek to put things right. It also allows victims to be discharged from this most mysterious thing of all about being a victim, which is the almost instinctive tendency to blame yourself for what happened. Self-blame, self-loathing are common features of victimization, and one way to deal with that is to have the person there talking about their contribution to what happened, so that the victim no longer blames him or herself. Fifthly, restorative justice grants empowerment to victim. Victimization is itself an experience of disempowerment on the one hand. In fact, the very word victim, I've only just realised this recently, is the negative correlate to the word victor in Latin. So a victim is somebody who loses. The victor is the person who wins. And so if you look it up in the OED, which I did the other day, a victim is a loser in war, or a loser at a judicial contest, or a sacrificial victim. Victimization is an experience of having your power taken away from you. And all victimization involves this loss of control over one's life. And on the other hand, it involves a disconnection with other people. There's a kind of isolating dimension to being the victim. Victims so often feel alone. And even when people try to reach out to them, they feel that it's not quite touching their sense of aloneness. They have a sense of a loss of relatedness to other people. Sometimes these feelings are exacerbated by the formal system. Victims can feel, not always, but sometimes they can feel that the justice system actually takes their experience off them, converts it into a foreign legal terminology, and then turns it over to trained specialists to deal with, so that they are rendered sort of spectators on their own pain and suffering. Which is probably why research all over the world shows that crime victims often end up feeling as much hostility towards the judicial system as they do towards their own offenders. This is, of course, even more so in cases, as we know, a lot of attention to this recently, in cases of sexual violence, where victims of sexual offending often feel that they are, in a sense, victimised a second time by the system. In contrast to that, restorative processes enable victims to be the central players. They are empowered by being fully involved in the disposition of their case. They understand what is taking place, and they're able to participate in securing the outcomes that will meet their needs. Sixthly, restorative justice offers victims restitution or reparation. Conferences usually aim at outcomes by which the offender agrees as insofar as is possible to make good the harm that has been inflicted. Now, part of that making good, that restitution, will be emotional by way of explanation and by way of apology, which is incredibly important to victims. If a victim is denied an apology by the person, it really, really, really hurts. Part of it will be emotional, part of it will be material by way of some sort of recompense or practical help. But whatever form it takes, restitution addresses another fundamental need of victims, which is the need for repair or recovery of loss. Finally, restorative justice offers victims hope. Hope for a future that is no longer blighted by bitterness and resentment. Hope is an essential ingredient for a healthy life, and a healthy society needs a shared sense of social hope in order to remain confident and purposeful. But hope has been called by some sociologists the rarest of all modern virtues. A vague sense of hopelessness pervades much of contemporary culture. And again, nowhere is this more apparent than in the situation of crime and punishment, with prisons being perhaps the most hopeless of all modern institutions. I mean, how we can call that system a correction system without smiling in disbelief, I don't know. As though the system corrects. Some sociologists are therefore suggesting that the true significance of restorative justice is its capacity to restore hope to a hopeless society. How? Because it doesn't simply seek to penalise past actions, but to address present needs and to equip for future life, and therefore provides a sense of hope. Hope for victims, hope for offenders, and hope for greater civility in society at large. I've almost finished. Restorative justice in these ways, I think, offers help and hope to victims. Now, some, as I said, claim that it's simply a way of being soft on offenders, but this is far from the case. First and foremost, restorative justice is about empowering victims to confront their abusers, in whom they are locked into a prison house of pain and shame, and to do it in a way that holds them genuinely accountable for their actions and that brings satisfaction to the needs they have. And for that reason, I believe that restorative justice is one of the most promising recent developments in our legal system for furthering the rights and the needs of victims. And it deserves the full support as well as the ongoing critique of those who are dedicated to the plight of victims. Thank you very much.